Good morning, and welcome to the 92nd Landon Lecture on Public Issues. We are very privileged to have as our speaker this morning the United States Secretary of Education, Lamar Alexander. Before I introduce our speaker, let me introduce to you other members of the platform party. On my left, Dr. Runa Michi, Professor of Political Science and President-elect of the K-State Faculty Senate. Runa? Next to her, Jackie McClaskey, an undergraduate student in agricultural economics and president of the Kansas State University student body. Jackie? On my right, Edward Seaton, chairman of the Landon Patrons and owner and publisher of the Manhattan Mercury. Ed? Next to him, Dr. Charles Reagan, chairman of the Landon Lecture Series and my executive assistant. Secretary Alexander was nominated by President George Bush on January 22, 1991, to serve as the U.S. Secretary of Education. His appointment was unanimously confirmed by the Senate on March 14, 1991. Immediately prior to assuming office, Secretary Alexander served as president of the University of Tennessee, a position he'd held since 1988. As you might remember, Secretary Alexander served as governor of Tennessee from 1979 to 1987. As chairman of the National Governors Association, he led the 50-state education survey Time for Results. In 1988, the Education Commission of the States gave him the James B. Conant Award for Distinguished National Leadership in Education. Lamar Alexander is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Vanderbilt University and was a law review editor at New York University. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the United States Secretary of Education, Lamar Alexander. Thank you.
Thank you, President Weefald, and distinguished ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Reagan and Mr. Seaton, Dr. Michi, and Jackie. It's nice to see all of you. I've been looking forward for a variety of reasons to this opportunity. Let me just say right up front that one of the major reasons is because I work for Nancy Landon Kassabaum, and she is the ranking Republican on the Education Committee in the United States Senate, and she gently, as Nancy gently does, encouraged me to come some time ago, and I told her I absolutely would. And I want to say right at the beginning that I know of no member of the United States Senate on either side of the aisle who is a more constructive force for education or who is more respected on education than Nancy is. Just last week, toward the end of the session, some funny things usually began to happen in the United States Congress, and Senator Kennedy, who's the chairman of the committee, and some others got together a bill that Nancy and the president thought had too much bureaucracy in it, too much money for overhead, not enough for classrooms, too much Washington control of local schools, not enough support for communities changing schools, and so she quietly said, I think it would be better if we just waited until January and did it right, and the Senate listened to her. So she has a tremendous influence. And then Senator Bob Dole, of course, is the Senate leader, a person I very much enjoy working with and respect. Washington, he's indispensable in Washington, and I'm sure he hopes you think he's indispensable in Kansas as the year goes on. There's another reason that I'm glad to be here, is that I'm a seventh-generation Tennessean with a Kansas interruption. My grandfather, whose name was R.R. Rankin, ran away from the mountains in Tennessee when he was 11 years old. and got as far as Texas, then to Oklahoma, and finally ended up in Newton, Kansas, where my mother grew up. And by the time I came along and was a young boy, my grandfather, named R.R. Rankin, was a Santa Fe Railway engineer, and insofar as I could tell, perhaps the most important man in the world, because that is the way a railroad engineer looked in 1945 to a five-year-old boy. We eventually made our way back to Tennessee, but I had some visits out here, and I remember how shocking it was to me to see things flat, which is different than we have in Tennessee, to see things squared off by the mile, to see all the sunflowers and the wheat, and it was a beautiful place. And my upbringing might sound familiar to you, even though it was back in Tennessee. It may have been the way many people in Kansas grew up. When I was appointed Secretary of Education, one of the reporters felt it necessary to write an article all about where I came from and described my growing up as it said, Mr. Alexander grew up in a lower middle class family in the edge of the mountains in Tennessee. I called my mother the next Monday, and she unfortunately had seen the article, and she was reading her Bible to gain strength for how to deal with this slur on the family. And I said, don't worry about this, Mother. People say things about people in public life. She said, but we never thought of ourselves that way. She said, you had everything important that you needed. You had a library card from the day you were 3 and music lessons from the day you were 4. And that's probably a pretty good way to begin to talk about our schools, because our schools really start with our families and our communities, and anything we do to create the best schools in the world has to begin there. I am impressed and flattered, really, to be a part of this distinguished lecture series named after Governor Landon. I even found at a flea market in Tennessee a Landon campaign button with sunflowers on it, and I've had nowhere to wear it. But I have it on today. I've had it for a couple of years. But I've noticed the distinguished lecturers who've been here. Thank you for including me. I feel at home because I'm at a university campus. I would say to President Weefald, I would like to know his secret. How does a university president get Sports Illustrated to write such a flattering article about a football team and a university's academic prowess? That was a tremendous compliment to you, and I'm impressed with what you've been able to do here at Kansas State. I didn't have always quite that same experience at the University of Tennessee. Everybody was always nice to me. The faculty was very nice to me, but it didn't always come across that way. For example, the first day I was there, Dr. Mitchie, I was filled with lots of enthusiasm, and one of the faculty members, and this is literally true, came up to me and said, you have a lot of enthusiasm for this new job. You remind me of Clark Kerr. Clark Kerr was the distinguished president of the University of California, so I said, thank you very much. And the faculty member said, yes, you know, he arrived and left the same way, fired with enthusiasm. And then that afternoon, and as Dave Barry would say, I'm not making this up, that afternoon, another faculty member came up and said, Mr. Alexander, I so enjoyed hearing Dick Estelle read your book on National Public Radio. I'd written a book about our living in Australia, and Dick Estelle had read that. And I said, thank you. She turned to walk away and then turned back and said, you know, I just love Dick Estelle. I think he could make the telephone book sound interesting. So you seem to be surviving very well here at Kansas State. And I'm not the secretary that you read about most of the time. I'm not the secretary of crime or of war or of the deficit or of the interest rates or of housing. Education is not usually on the front page or at the top of the evening news, but increasingly in America, it is seen as the solution to most of what is on the front page or the top of the evening news. But still, my children tell me with some amusement that I rank 17th in the line of succession in Washington, D.C. And so far as I know, there's only one cabinet member below me, and that's Veterans Affairs, and I believe he left the other day, if I'm not mistaken. So if you wake up some morning and see me on television reassuring you that everything is all right in America, you can be confident it is not all right, because they will have worked their way down through 16 people to get to me to put me into the top of the heap. The Gallup poll a couple of years ago, with Phi Delta Kappa helping to ask the questions, asked it this way: if you were to look ahead for 25 years in America and rate as very important, somewhat important, less important, the following things, how would you do it? The best military in the world. This was, in fact, about the time of the Persian Gulf War, and 45% of people said very important, others down the line. The strongest system of industrial production in the world, 66% said very important. The best education system in the world, 86% said very important to the future of our country for the next 25 years. We don't really need a survey to tell us that. We have a consensus in America that goes something like this today. Our schools and colleges are the best in the world, but we're concerned about our elementary and secondary schools. We're not up to where we ought to be, and we're worried about it, and we wonder why. We have pride in our teachers. We like our schools, but as a nation, we suspect we're at risk, and increasingly we're becoming to think that if the nation is at risk, that in Manhattan or Nashville or Fresno, we may be at risk in our own hometowns too. That is why the simple phrase, creating the best schools in the world, has, I think, become a phrase that could rally more Americans during the 1990s than almost any other phrase we could utter. It brings out the best in most of us in our own hometowns. The reasons for this we also seem to agree about by and large. Standards are different today. At the Saturn plant in Tennessee, where they make cars, and they're doing pretty well with it, so we're told in the newspaper, there are more people who want the cars than there are cars to sell. They rank high on customer satisfaction. They did all this 10 years ago, you remember, by sending teams around the world and saying, what would it take to create the best cars in the world? And they came and started a new plant from scratch. It was sort of messy, and people made fun of it, but now they're putting steering wheels on the right-hand side to sell these cars in Japan. At that Saturn plant, to get a job on the headlight assembly team, you have to know mathematics, estimation. You have to be able to read and speak and write English well, because you're expected to be part of a team. In other words, you have to know a lot of things that you might not have had to know 10 or 15 years ago to work in an automobile plant. And if you don't know those things, the headlight assembly team doesn't want you on the team, because they've got to make a defect-free headlight. If they can't, they lose their job. Standards are different, and in many of our schools, we're still as if we were expecting our Olympic pole vaulters to use a bamboo pole instead of a fiberglass pole. That's a change. A second change is children are growing up differently. In Kansas or in Tennessee, we might say, well, that's true a little bit, but fortunately, we're not like some of the other places in America. And some of the other places in America have some absolutely staggering challenges. Take California. The Secretary of Education in California will tell you that there are 200,000 new children coming into the California schools every year. Now, the Chicago public school system is the third largest in the country, and it has 400,000 students in it today. So every year in California, every 2 years, a number of children that would fill up the Chicago schools. Every year for the next 10 years, 200,000. About 25% of the babies born in California have something toxic in them when they're born, according to the State Department of Education, because the mother had alcohol or drugs in her. And 22% of the children in the schools don't speak English. And if that's true, I've been in the California schools enough to know there are a great many other children in the schools who don't speak English well. That's an enormous challenge. Children are growing up differently today. We all know that, but we don't respond to that as quickly as we might. We adults are in a different situation. My sister lives in Tulsa. She goes to Dallas every year and has for 10 years to learn more about computers to keep her job at the telephone company. Students at Kansas State are getting to be older. At our community colleges, they're even older than that. We talk about lifelong learning. Things are changing. And then our schools themselves, which Dr. Coleman at the University of Chicago said were created in the first place to do for families some things families couldn't do as well, fit the families and the times of our grandfathers, but not today. Our schools are really in sort of a time warp, frustrating those who work within them, and too often simply boring the students. Now, in saying that, we have to be very careful, because we're not saying that's the fault of the people in the schools or that's the fault of the people here. We're just saying the world's changed, and here we are, and we're all in it together. And we don't drive Model T Fords. We don't deliver the mail by Pony Express anymore. We don't watch black and white television anymore, but we're still operating the schools the way we did in my grandfather's day, by and large, when schools were open 4 months a year and children learned math and science to about the 4th grade. You may say, well, that's a fairly extreme statement to make, but I think I can suggest to you that it's not extreme at all. And perhaps our biggest challenge is recognizing that the response we need to make to the challenges we have in elementary and secondary education must be much bolder than anything most of us are thinking about today. California, for example, in response to this challenge I mentioned earlier, and budget cuts and other things that are going on there, immigration problems, has passed a new law creating 100 charter schools. This, I would suggest, is in exactly the right direction. It would take off the government rules, take off the union rules, invite teams of teachers to design wholly new schools to reach the national education goals. Here are the goals, here are the children, here's the freedom to design a school that meets the needs of the children. Now operate under the charter you create. These would be public schools in the case of California. I would like to suggest that I would think a better response for California to make would be 1,000 new charter schools every year for the next 10 years. And I would like to briefly show you how President Bush's America 2000 education agenda would support such an effort in California or in Kansas. Now let me say a word about Commander-in-Chief presidential leadership, since we're coming up on these presidential debates in just a few days. And let's be honest about this. We Americans prefer Commander-in-Chief leadership. It would be very nice if the president of whatever party could come out one day and say, here's an enemy. Our elementary and secondary schools aren't what they ought to be. We're going to call up these superb men and women in the armed forces, and we're going to fix them. And we'll have the Secretary of Defense report to you every morning as you wake up, before you go off to work, about how this is going to be done. You won't have to worry about it very much. Give us a lot of encouragement. We might charge you a little extra money to do it, but we'll get it done. We'll have it done in about 100 hours, and we'll be able to sum it up in sound bites on the evening news for a while, and then you can go on to something else. It won't work that way. The leadership to help our schools, our families, the drug problem, any of these issues that concern America the most right now require a different sort of presidential leadership than we've come to ask for from any of our presidents lately. I would suggest that this is what the president and the governors of both political parties were doing 3 years ago when they met in Charlottesville, Virginia, and created 6 very ambitious national education goals. First time we've ever done that in American history. President Kennedy said, let's go to the moon in 1961. We got there by 1969. President Bush and the governor said a similar thing in 1989, about the decade of the 90s. Just last month, more than 2,500 America 2000 communities were working together at the largest satellite TV town meeting in American history to reach those goals. That means in Manhattan or Topeka or Maryville or Anchorage, where they meet in a renovated theater, they had a downlink and they were a part of an effort to work together on goal number 1, for example. How do all children arrive at school ready to learn? Of course, there's funding that we need to do to our existing school system to help it succeed, and we've been trying to do that by increasing Head Start, by increasing the number of scholarships for students who attend Kansas State and other colleges and universities in Kansas to record level. Admiral Watkins, the Secretary of Energy, with David Kearns, the former Xerox chairman, have rounded up about $2 billion of federal funding for math and science education and refocused it on teacher training. Funding for elementary and secondary education is very important, but if all we do is put more money in the system we now have, we'll all be very disappointed by the end of the year 2000. Already, we spend a lot more per student on elementary and secondary education in America than any of our major international competitors, and about 50% more than the Japanese and the Germans do. Please don't misunderstand me. The President is willing to invest much more money in education. In fact, has, but believes it ought to be in a different system. Different kinds of schools, like the charter schools. The President has asked Congress to appropriate $500 million to help charter schools, new schools, break them old schools. He calls them New American Schools be created. He's asked every one of the more than 2,000 America 2000 communities to think about creating such a different kind of schools. He has asked American business to raise $200 million, which they are, to give to design teams, some 700 of which have formed, to help communities create such schools, rethink the schools from top to bottom. And we're beginning to see some of these. In Bensonville, Illinois, for example, a village of 17,000, they're turning the whole community into a school. The school will be open from 6 in the morning till 10 at night every day. Now, that's not to require anybody to go all that time, or with the expectation that anybody would go there all that time, any more than just because the grocery store is open 24 hours a day, you'll go in and sit on the meat counter just because it's open. You are attracted to the school is the idea. You'll learn math at the bank, physics at the hospital, journalism at the newspaper. The idea would be the whole community would become a community of learners. That's a very different idea for school. Another one of the New American Schools design teams is affiliated with Outward Bound, and there they'll be talking about organizing expeditions to learn about schools. The students will always be either a part of an expedition or preparing for an expedition. In Minnesota, one of the design teams is thinking about charter and contract schools. That is, contracting with businesses, museums, really any organization in town that wishes to create a school, and letting the school board make a decision about whether it's up to standard, and if it is, let it operate with the money following the children to the school. These different models, these different academic programs will be all over the landscape by the end of the 1990s, and my guess will be that our children will be attending school for much longer periods of time and learning by the time they're 11 and 12, what many of them are learning by the time they're 17 and 18. We're changing what we teach. By 1994 to 95, the President will have funded and helped to have encouraged a consensus about world-class standards in science, math, English, history, geography, arts, and civics. Math is already done thanks to the math teachers of this country who got way out front 8 years ago and agreed on what fourth graders ought to know and be able to do about mathematics to live, work, and compete with children from all over the world. There will be no federal law about this. Nobody will be required to do this by a government at some distance. It will be available, though, in case a parent in Manhattan, Kansas wants to walk into a school board meeting and say, are we using in our schools the math standards of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, and if not, why not? And then there will be assessments, examinations, not these standardized examinations, but much more oriented toward problem solving, a national system of such examinations, which you also would be able to use. Ready by 94, 95. Deregulation of schools. The president is having a big argument with Congress over this. We would like to eliminate the federal recipe book for most of the federal spending that goes on in this country in classrooms, because people at a distance can't tell teachers what to do very effectively in the classroom. Congress does not want to do that, but many states are moving ahead with it. And finally, the president would like to move ahead with what he calls a GI Bill for children. That is to say, if we create in this country this large new menu of educational opportunities and academic programs, different kinds of schools that attract students, we would like to give scholarships to middle and low income families that they can spend at any of these schools or academic programs, just as the GIs had such scholarships when they came back from World War II, and just as half the Kansas college students have Pell Grants or federal grants and loans, which they may spend at Kansas State or perish the thought Kansas or any private university that they might choose to attend. The GI Bill for children runs into a lot of opposition from some in the public schools and the teachers' union leaders who are reluctant to lose control over the schools to parents about where the children go to school. The president happens to think that giving parents consumer power, dollars to spend at the elementary and high schools of their choice, will help, is not only fair to those parents, but will help change the schools and improve them, and will also give the schools new federal dollars to help make those changes. Most of the money that comes under the GI Bill for children, we would expect, would follow the children into public schools, because we would expect in most places that is what children would choose. So there is a lot going on. Most places where I go, I ask a group of fifth graders, the class of 2000, to stand and repeat the 6 national education goals. One reason is because they symbolize a vision for our country's future and remind us of why we're talking about all these things. Another is because we all understand that when these fifth graders go to the family reunion in a few years, when they're seniors, members of the class of 2000, we'll all look at them, if Kansas is anything like Tennessee, and say, "Oh my goodness, how you've changed. I don't even recognize you." And people will pull at their hair and their ear and poke at them, and they'll want to go away and go home. But the same thing will be happening to our schools. We will be fortunate if between now and the time our fifth graders are members of the class of 2000, if our schools change as much as the children do. That's the measure of change we need to expect. That is why Honeywell Corporation in Minneapolis has a high school in its corporate headquarters for pregnant girls. The government money follows the girls to the high school. It is a public school. It serves a real need. That is why more communities are thinking about contract schools. Why shouldn't the museum have an elementary school or a third grade or an after-school program or a summer program? I mean, what is to say that only one group of people in town should offer the only schools? In Minnesota, they're having kindergartens in banks, a whole range of educational opportunities in shopping malls. And in Baltimore, one last example, which I think is a very interesting example. A very courageous school superintendent, Walter Ampry, who grew up in Baltimore, taught in Baltimore, and has decided that the schools in the inner city desperately need change, has contracted with a private company to operate 9 public schools. Educational Alternatives is the name of the company. This would not be considered very unusual at Kansas State or the University of Tennessee, where the presidents are always looking for ways to get private business involved with the education system. But in our elementary and secondary school, it's sometimes considered downright treasonous by some people. What is happening in Baltimore? This contract was signed 35 days before school opened. I was there on the 2nd day of the opening of school. The elementary school that I attended, the teachers told me, was filled with a urine stench for the last 10 years. It was fit for a king or a queen on the day that I attended and the day before when the children came back to school. What had happened? They had privatized the custodial system. They had hired a private company to clean up the school, and they'd done it in 35 days. One teacher said, "For a year, I've been trying to get the drinking fountain fixed. I called on the first day of school, and it was fixed in an hour. I didn't know what to do, she said. I wasn't expecting that. They are using the same amount of money to operate these schools, the public schools superintendent and the private company, that they do to operate all the other schools in town. But they are able to put 2 teachers in every classroom, $400,000 of computer equipment into every one of the 9 schools they're operating. They're going to have an individual educational program for every child in the school. Every child is a part of special education. And the most radical innovation they have is that every teacher has a telephone. You don't know how much that means. Here we've had telephones 100 years in this country, and schools are so empty of technology by and large that teachers have a hard time making a phone call. Now, this experiment in Baltimore is running into a lot of problems. The Paraprofessionals Union is very upset because if you're going to put 2 teachers in every classroom, you don't need the paraprofessionals. There's not anything for them to do. And that union is blocking some progress in that case. But that is the beginning of an example of what a pioneering school superintendent, willing to work in that case with a private company, that's not the only way to do it, is able to do with the same amount of money to meet the needs of children. My guess is that kind of educational change will attract all the money Baltimore needs to create the best schools in the world for those children. A few years ago, after I was governor, our family lived in Australia. We wanted to just get away for a while, and coming back, our children, we came through China, and our children began to make lists of things they could do back in America that the Chinese children couldn't do. Take a job where they pleased, go to the college where they pleased, marry whom they pleased, live where they pleased. That was 1987. We took a train from Moscow to Paris, crossed the Berlin Wall in the middle of the night. We got a much better understanding of this country from the chance to live outside of this country. We've watched, as you have, the whole world change in the last 5 years. I don't need to detail it, but it has been remarkable. We were entranced with Václav Havel speaking to his countrymen and women in Czechoslovakia, asking them questions like, what kind of place is this? What are the principles that bind us together? What is important to us? Somehow we Americans always expect that to happen somewhere else. So we have gotten very grumpy now that this change and revolution has suddenly jumped across the ocean and landed right in Manhattan, Kansas, and Nashville, Tennessee, and Los Angeles, California, and all over America. That is what is going on today in the midst of this election year, and it is a very healthy thing. We are in transition, just like every other country in the world, except there's one difference. What we saw when we lived outside of America and what I see every day in schools where I go and see inspiring teachers and creative superintendents and things happening is that we have more capacity to deal with the transition than any other country in the world. We still have the best colleges and universities. We still are the world grand champion in science and technology. We still are the most productive workers in the world. We have 25% of all the world's money and 5% of all the world's population. And we sit around and act like sometimes we don't have the capacity to do what we need to do. The 1990s are going to be a very exciting time for America. We're going to go through this transition well, realize that we'll have to do what they were doing in Czechoslovakia, ask of ourselves the questions. What are the principles that bind us together? What is most important? What do we have to contribute to each other in the world? And then we will have to find ways in our own communities, not the commander-in-chief type leadership, in our own communities to solve the problems that are most important to us. That is why education, while it's not on the front page or at the top of the evening news, has moved to the top of the list of the things we argue about at the dinner table, of the things that people say on polls they care about. I can think of no other challenge that would get our feet on the ground better in America than mobilizing, as we're doing, community by community by community, to create the best schools in the world for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alexander, for your outstanding presentation here this morning. And now we would like to have members of the audience think of several questions that they might have in mind for the Secretary. And if you wouldn't mind. Right. We'll have microphones on the left. We'll have microphones on the right. Okay. We're going to have microphones, as you can see, over to your left and to your right. And if you could just go back and forth.
Yes.
Mr. Secretary, good morning.
Yes.
As a minority student, I found it disturbing that I didn't hear you mention the promotion of multicultural and bilingual educations. How is your current planning to break down the cycle of Eurocentric and patriotism-oriented curricula? And how are you going to ensure that the new systems that you suggest are going to empower the poor and the minority youth instead of maintaining the current white power structure?
Well, thank you for the question. The best way for all young people in America, or really people of any age, to move from the back of the line to the front of the line is to learn math, science, English, history, and geography well. I mean, if you want a job at the Saturn plant in Tennessee, you've got to know and be able to speak English well. You've got to know estimation, you've got to know all those subjects well. Multicultural education is very important. I can't imagine, people define that different ways, but the way I define it, I can't imagine a school or a class in this country that does not help students understand the importance of how this country was formed by people who have many different backgrounds. I mean, what is special about America is that we have many different backgrounds and we want to have a common idea. I see many examples of that in the Bronx. In a school I visited there, it was largely populated by children from South America. And the teachers of the kindergarten students were pointing to the George Washington Bridge, teaching about Simon Bolivar and saying, this is the George Washington of the country where your ancestors grew up, and here's who George Washington is in America. I think it's important for children to know both. In East Los Angeles, I know a Spanish teacher who encourages all of her students of Hispanic background to prepare for the Spanish AP test in high school, because some of them can make a 4 or a 5 on it more easily than other students can, but they must continue to learn English. I also think it's very important that all of our students have a chance to learn the ideas that help to create this country. Many of those are Western ideas, and we should be, it would be hard to understand America if we didn't have those. We don't propose to prescribe from the federal level how to do all of that. I think it should be done school by school.
Sir, if I may, I apologize for the second question.
No, that's all right.
It's not just important that those in the inner city and the high concentration of minorities receive this education. It's also important that the students in suburban and middle and white America in the middle middle states where there is low concentrations of minorities or where there's high levels of racism get this education, so to break the cycle of ignorance. How do you intend to do that?
Well, I think the best way to do that is to encourage people who operate schools at a local level to do that. I don't think you want someone in Washington telling principals of 110,000 schools across the country how to do it. I try to do it in all of my remarks. For example, in most schools I visit, I give a copy of my friend Alex Haley's book, Roots, or the autobiography of Malcolm X. I grew up in the mountains in an area where most people were Scotch-Irish, and we wanted people to learn more about people of different backgrounds. I think learning of different backgrounds is a very important part of learning about America, and I try to say that wherever I go. I don't.
You didn't say it here, and I certainly hope that you do intend to do so.
Well, I think I just did say it.
Only when prompted by a student.
Well, you could stay for the rest of it. I might say it again. We might. Anyone else who has? we had a minister at home who would preach a good sermon about Matthew, and there was always somebody in the back of the row who'd ask why he hadn't talked about Mark, but you can't do it all in one sermon. Who else has a question? Yes.
Hi. I have a question. I was reading your national education goals, and I think they're very lofty, and I think they're wonderful, and it would be wonderful if we could achieve them, but what seemed to be missing was any discussion about teachers. And I think something that could be added to your goals would be that all schools will employ teachers who are capable of ensuring that students are challenged to meet the goals that you've set out. I just came from my daughter's 5th grade class before I came here, and I took with me a handful of papers that were all marked A+, -0. And I had taken those papers and corrected them myself. Now, that's very frustrating for me because I don't want to say to my daughter, your teacher is not doing her job. I don't want to say to my daughter, you really aren't doing A work. I took the papers in and I said to the teacher, you know, there are several spelling errors here. The directions call for using complete sentences. There are 2 sentences that are not complete. And she said to me, this paper is worth X number of points. If I took off for every misspelled word, no one would pass. And the response I did not make, but what I would have liked to have made was, none of them should pass if they cannot do this correctly. What are we going to do about incompetent teachers and the union that keeps incompetent teachers in the classroom?
Well, that you're doing exactly what you should be doing about it. The next step, I think, would be to talk to the principal about that. The next step would be to run for the school board, and the next step would be to run for the General Assembly. I'm being quite serious about this. When I was governor of Tennessee, one thing, the way we tried to approach that was to create a system of paying more for teaching well. And so we put into our state law, I think we're the only state that still does that, a system where we invite teachers to have the opportunity to take 10, 11, 12-month contracts and to be paid more based upon that and the fact that they're judged in an evaluation, in a peer evaluation system, to be good teachers. 8,500 teachers have gone through that process and are now being paid more for teaching well, and they've come up through a very creative system. What I wanted to do was to make that required. In other words, you had to go up into that system after a while if you were hired after the law passed. After I left office, the teachers union got that changed, so it's not required anymore. But that is one of the concerns. As we have more challenging subject matter, we're going to have very talented teachers. It will be hard to do that unless we create financial incentives for them. We can't pay all teachers $60,000, $80,000, $90,000 a year, but there's no reason we shouldn't pay many teachers that, and we could afford to do that. Another thing we have to recognize is that teacher retraining is very important. Many of the teachers that we have today can perform very well if they're given the time and the opportunity to train themselves properly for these new standards that are being imposed.
And it's your feeling that that should come from the community level and the government can't?
I think it has to come from the state and local level. I just don't think you want people in Washington, which is really, education politics in Washington is really dominated by special interest groups, and there's more creativity in a square yard in Kansas than there is in all of Washington in education, and you don't want your schools run from Washington.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, and just for the record, I'm running for the school board.
Oh, you are? Yes.
Hello, my name is Spencer Timmons, and I'm a strong believer in the American system and the American dream. And I congratulate you for the work you and President Bush have done, and I'd like to ask if I might come up and shake your hand.
Yes, sir. I didn't do that. I didn't. Anyone else? Over here.
My son attends a school here in this community called the Oak Grove School.
Yes.
It's a wonderful school.
Mm-hmm.
It was started last year, not-for-profit school by a group of mothers, and it's doing a lot of what Workforce 2000 calls for. It's a multi-graded first kindergarten through third grade. All of the students are in one classroom. Mm-hmm. Parents take part in it. But the school is struggling right now financially and for resources, support. And the problem that we're finding is that the support that seems to be directed to companies that you mentioned in your speech in the Workforce 2000 and at Topeka, or just support in general, is invisible. It's hard to find where to go to support this kind of grassroots initiative, particularly very small schools. And I was wondering if you could comment on, where do we go to get help, and if anybody wants to send their kids to Oak Grove, please. You can talk to me. I'm John Bunch. I'm teaching the management department.
Well, here the specific President Bush has proposed that the GI Bill for kids would help that situation if it were to pass, because families in Manhattan would choose the school or academic program, and as long as it was a lawfully operated school, the $1,000 scholarship would follow the child to the school. Or what I think should happen in communities around the country is I think school boards ought to be on the lookout for academic programs operated by others. If teams of teachers create a new school, or parents, or if a business wants to open a elementary school in its headquarters because that keeps the parents and the children closer together during the day when the parents are working, I think a school board ought to be on the lookout for high-quality programs like that, certify them, and let the public money follow the children to those schools. The objective ought to be to have a system within which all children, regardless of income, have the largest number of options for the highest quality education. We have that with our colleges and universities, and it operates just that way. We need to have that among our elementary and secondary schools, but we're not accustomed to that, and it represents quite a change in thinking. Yes?
I'm Susan Ike. I'm a non-traditional student here at K-State in my junior year. With the emphasis on elementary education and raising functional, productive members of our society, social workers and speech pathologists will become increasingly important to this program that you're trying to encourage. Do you feel universities have a responsibility to educate these professionals to meet the growing need in our society?
I think I'm about to be caught in an internal discussion. And I was university president long enough to know better than to get into that. I think that's something that you have to decide here. Obviously, the professions and the disciplines that you speak of are extraordinarily important. I think each of our campuses has to make a decision about what it can emphasize and what it can afford to do, and that's best done by the campus itself, not best done by wandering lecturers who come in and make offhand observations.
Okay, can I rephrase the question, please?
Sure.
Do you feel that those professions are important to our education and our society?
Sure, of course.
Thank you.
And I admire you for being a non-traditional student. Thank you for...
Hello.
Yes.
My name is Marilyn Emling Jacoby. I'm also a non-traditional student, a senior in journalism and mass communication. I have a son who's a senior at Penn State, and another son who is a freshman at the University of Texas. My question is, considering the lofty ambitions of America 2000, when will the national educational system cease punishing academically gifted children by teaching to the middle of the range and to the below average student?
Well, none of the break the mold charter schools that the president is encouraging do that. And the idea that I mentioned in Baltimore of giving every child an individual education plan to reach the full potential of that child is exactly what we should be doing. I think if we freed our schools of the recipe books, rules, and regulations that are well-intentioned, that are handed down from a distance, set very high goals, very high standards, deregulate the schools, and give parents the opportunity to choose among schools and education programs, that problem would solve itself in that way, because if you're the parent of a gifted child, you're going to search for the school that meets that child's needs best. If you have money, you already can do that. If you have less money, you're often stuck.
Thank you, Mr. Alexander.
Let's have one more question over there.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
My name is David Royce. I teach music here at K-State.
Oh.
And I'll footnote that I was a student, an undergraduate student at Austin Peay State University when you came to solo with our orchestra. He's a considerable pianist, by the way.
Thank you.
Obviously, our profession is concerned about the arts not being included in this proposal, and I believe that you all have been working on that. Do you see that it will be added eventually?
Well, the answer is it has been added, and I'm glad you raised that, because no one should think that the president nor I nor any of us think that arts are an integral part of everyone's education. I mentioned a little earlier, my mother felt I had the right start by having a library card from the day I was 3 and music lessons from the day I was 4. What happened was goal number 3 of the National Education Goals said children shall learn challenging subject matters such as English, math, science, history, and geography, and stop there, not wanting to appear to be designating a national curriculum, which we do not want to even appear to be doing. That, of course, left out some subjects and some areas that are integral to education. We don't even think of the arts as a separate subject. We think of it as integral to an entire education. Therefore, we formed the America 2000 Arts Partnership. Jim Wolfenson, who is the head of the Kennedy Center in Washington, and a group of arts educators and others around the country are working to help develop standards and curricula and suggestions, and we're communicating that to the more than 2,000 communities that are working on the national education goals. So we're going to do everything we can to make sure that people know that we understand that the arts are an important part of any plan for this country to reach the national education goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thanks so much.
Press corps in Washington. I've said most of what I had to say in there, so maybe would you like me to say it again, or would you like me to answer your questions? Why don't I just answer your questions?
You talked a lot about secondary and elementary education
Mhm.
and the goals there, but you didn't really talk about higher education. Does higher education have a role in the 2000 goals, or do you have a separate agenda for it?
It does have a very important role. Goal number 5 of the 6 goals talks about a skilled, literate workforce, lifelong learning. And the President's focus has been to give more Americans access to what we think is the best system of colleges and universities in the world. That's why we have a record number of federal grants and loans. That's why he's increased federal spending for Pell Grants, the largest federal scholarship, by about 50% in the last 4 years. We tried to recognize that more working people want to go back to school, and so the President asked Congress this year for the first time to make it possible for working people to go back to a community college or a college and receive the federal scholarship, even if they're enrolling in just one course, which ought to make it easier for a single mother with a job and a child who wants to also continue her education. I guess the short answer is we have the best system of colleges and universities in the world, and what we're trying to do is to make it available to more Americans. What we need to do with elementary and secondary education is to change it and create the best system of colleges and universities in the world. That's a bigger challenge.
Out of the questions you answered today
Mhm.
from the audience, all but one were negative. And I'm interested to know why you think most people are attacking the America 2000 education program when it is, if as you say your statistics are correct, most people see education as the answer to the problems we face.
I didn't recall all the questions negative.
Well, at least, the minorities, the arts, what are you going to do about addressing poor teachers? Why do you think there are so many people?
Yeah, well, I think these are, the America 2000 is about goals. I mean, I'm not arriving, and the President is not trying to arrive with a recipe book in Manhattan, Kansas, and say, this is how to reach the goals. Or what the President has asked Manhattan, Kansas to do is adopt the goals, develop its own strategy for reaching them. So it's up to Manhattan, Kansas to decide if it wants arts in the curriculum, and if so, how. It's up to Manhattan, Kansas to decide how to pay its teachers and what to do about teachers who aren't so good. It's up to you in your own hometown to define multicultural and to make sure that students learn about people of many different backgrounds. We don't propose to have a federal recipe book about that. The President's agenda is ambitious goals, thousands of communities mobilizing to reach the goals, funding of important programs like Head Start and college scholarships, and then helping communities create charter schools, helping educators understand higher standards, deregulating schools so teachers are free to teach, and giving parents more choices of schools. We're trying to create an environment in which people create the best schools in the world, not do it for them.
I wondered if there's any information about Americans, for the most part, being pleased with the America 2000 goals, or are people critical and think they don't go far enough? Or
well, the people, you know, you can, this is a big country and it takes a while to learn the goals. I think that, I mean, just this afternoon I'm going to Kansas City, where several school districts in the Kansas City area on both sides of the state line are going to initiate Kansas City 2000. There are now more than 2,000 such efforts. There are more than 2,500 communities each month who participate in our satellite town meeting. On October 13th, the hour's discussion will be about how do we help children become first in the world of math and science. And so we'll be talking about that goal, the standards, when the standards will be ready, when the mathematics achievement tests will be ready, how to retrain the teachers, what the federal government can do to help. But primarily, we're trying to move the country in a direction, and that's a little different than going to war, where the President does it all for you. In this case, the President helps you understand the problem, sets a goal, challenges you, boldly supports controversial ideas, and then helps with federal dollars wherever he can. Sir.
A gentleman who shall remain anonymous, unidentified, but who aspires to the presidency, established a grading system of teachers. And the secondary part of that, how do you respond to that? Secondary part, and I listened to your speech, you seem to suggest that the unionized teachers have too much input into the system.
I don't think it's the teachers. The teachers don't have enough input into the system. The union leaders get in the way. I mean, they're the ones who are in. Just to give you an example, I invited the president of the National Education Association to go with me to Capitol Hill and help lobby the Congress to take the federal rules off his members, free them to teach, let them come up with their own strategies for reaching the goals. And he said no, he likes the rules. So when we try to create new American schools or higher standards or deregulate the schools or give families choices, the National Education Association gets in the way. And that's one of the main differences between President Bush and Governor Clinton. He is allied with the teachers union, and President Bush is not. Sir.
You mentioned your support for lifelong learning.
Mm-hmm.
You could devise a national policy in lifelong learning. What would be the components of it? What would it look like?
Well, first I'd try to have the best, most diverse, most available, and best system of higher education and continuing education in the world. Fortunately, we have that. Second, I'd try to make sure that the largest number of Americans had a chance to go and to choose among a wide variety, that the largest number of Americans has the widest variety of choices of those institutions. Not all can or should go to Harvard, or not all can or should go to Kansas State, but they should have several options available. And that is why the federal grants and loans have been increased to help make that possible. 1 out of 2 Kansas college students now has a federal grant or a loan to help pay for college. We've tried to think of other important steps to take, like giving working families a chance to use their federal scholarship if they're only taking 1 course. That recognizes how busy working parents are today. Those are some of the things. Yes, ma'am.
What do you think of homeschools, children who are taught in their home?
I admire parents who have a commitment to homeschooling. It takes a substantial commitment by a parent to help a children today learn what a child needs to know to live, work, and compete in this world. And as time goes along, most parents find a school that that will help them educate their child. We believe that by giving parents more choices of schools, that some parents who choose homeschooling because their child doesn't fit in the school to which they're assigned will be able to use the school system better. By the end of the 90s, I would like to see more homeschooling, but I would like to see more children spending more time in school as well. In other words, I can see a typical child attending one school from 7 till 2, maybe an after-school program from 2 to 5, and being hooked by a telecomputer to a learning system that permits more learning at home. In other words, homeschooling would be more integrated into what a school can do. Schools, after all, were established to do for families things families can't do as well. So I think there's always a place for committed parents who want to help their children learn.
Do you think that homeschool should be included in the GI Bill for children?
Well, the GI Bill for children would permit homeschools to be included. That would have to be done under conditions established by each state, because those dollars could only go to lawfully operated schools, but that could include homeschools.